All right. How are you doing? We got you in the studio finally.
Yeah, I just had a long drive over from Utah this morning or yesterday.
Okay. How long is the drive down?
It's about 8 hours.
Yeah. And where are you in Utah exactly?
Kanab, Utah, which is about 35 minutes from the east entrance to Zion National Park.
And that's one of the most stunning places in the world, isn't it?
It is a really, really neat place. There's so much to do in that area.
Yeah. And how's your 2024 been?
So far, so good. It's going to get better here soon. I'm leaving shortly after this to go to Yosemite, so
That'd be nice. What are you doing at Yosemite?
I'm going to climb a route on El Cap.
El Capitan. Wow. Just for fun?
That's exactly what I do it for. It's for fun.
That's pretty serious climbing, though. I mean, for someone like me who's, I guess, not really a technical rock climber, but I've done some peaks around the world, but it's mostly walking and walking in crampons. But that's like proper vertical climbing. That's got to be amazing to be able to navigate up on a wall like that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I first climbed El Cap when I was 19 years old, 1979. So I believe I'm the only person that has continuously climbed El Cap for the last 6 decades.
That's pretty epic. That's a great thing to hold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My partner, who I'm going to be climbing with on this trip, and who I've climbed with a lot and climbed with back in the 70s and 80s, he thought that it was he and I that had both were the only two that had ever climbed El Cap in the last 6 decades, but he figured out, I think only about a year or so ago, he's like, you know what? In 1979, I tried El Cap, but I didn't actually do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did climb it, but with a different partner that year. So it's pretty cool.
So, I mean, people out there watching the podcast and following along, like everyone, I guess, knows El Capitan from Free Solo, right?
Yep.
So Alex Honnold goes and climbs the fucking thing with no ropes, and now the whole world knows it. But
yeah,
obviously, very crazy. But obviously, it was super famous before that, and people have been climbing it. I mean, when was it first climbed? I mean, what's the history of this rock face?
Yeah, so it was first climbed in 1958.
Okay.
And it was climbed by Warren Harding and several of his partners. They had actually wanted to do a route on Half Dome, but Royal Robbins had beat them to the punch on that. And so they looked around, and the next obvious thing, obviously very obvious, was El Capitan that hadn't been climbed. A lot of folks thought it wasn't able to be climbed because of how tall and sheer it was or is. And so after a long siege effort, they climbed the route in 1958. And then, it's been climbed ever since. There's over 100 routes now and major variations on the face. And so, for a long time, it was primarily aid climb. And aid climbing meaning you're putting a piece of gear in the rock. You're clipping what's called a atria or a ladder into it, which is a nylon kind of ladder with steps in it, and you're climbing up on the piece as high as you can and placing another piece. Now, in the last several years, free climbing has taken hold. Free climbing is where you're using the rock to make upwards progress, and you're only the rope is only there to catch you if you fall. So you're not hanging on it. And so that's gotten really popular. And then, of course, Alex comes along and does Free Solo, or Free Solo is the route. So that's without a rope, which is crazy. As someone who has done all the routes that he was on, so the route that he did is kind of pieces of different routes. As someone who's done all those routes, I can tell you that the thing that's really crazy that a lot of folks don't get about what he did is that the rock up there, it's glacial polish. It's very smooth. It's very slippery. You have to have your feet and your hands exactly right with the pressure at the exact right angle so you don't slip off of it. And so that's what makes it, to me, all the more rad or wild that he was able to do that and do it successfully.
Yeah. And he won an Oscar on top of it.
Exactly.
Enough of Alex, though. So when did you first know that you like wanted to live your life outdoors? Because you've had an incredible kind of climbing career. You've done some expeditions all around the world in interesting and amazing places. Like, where'd you grow up, for example?
Yeah, so I grew up just north of here in the Bay Area, so San Jose area.
Not particularly a famous place for adventuring.
No, not necessarily, but you'd be surprised. There's a lot of climbers that have come out of the Bay Area, famous climbers. So, I have a younger brother. He's 3 years younger than me. And so as a family, my parents having 2 young boys who were, as boys are, very active, needed to get out a lot. We spent a lot of time camping, going to the national parks. My parents bought a boat when I was like 9 years old. And so we would go out and go water skiing on local lakes and reservoirs and camping out on the weekends. But we were always outdoors. We were always doing something. And if there was a rock or if there was a hill, my mom would say that you could find me, scrambling around on that. And, I think one of the things that perhaps subliminally got me interested in climbing is when I was 10 years old, and my mom has a Super 8 video of this. We were in Yosemite, and my mom, who is a little bit more adventurous than my dad, my mom and I walked up the Talus Field to the base of El Cap, and I have this video of me at 10 years old walking up to the base of El Cap and placing my hand, on El Cap. And it's actually, and I looked at I found the Super 8 video not that long ago and kind of ID'd the exact spot, that I went up to and touched, which was the base of a route called the Zodiac, or it's actually very close to the base of Zodiac, which at that time hadn't even been climbed yet.
Were you just like putting your hand on it to claim ownership?
Something like that. I just wanted to touch it. It was a reverence thing, I think. But how I actually got into climbing was my parents were we were on a family vacation in the Tetons. And so I think my parents wanted to have some alone time. And they put my brother and I in the Exum Mountaineering School as something to do for the kids for one afternoon. And that was really cool. I remember, I think I was 16 at the time, one of the last, family summer vacations with the kids.
Before you guys got too rowdy?
Well, before we were going to, be hopefully out of the house and going away to college. Mm. And so... So we did the Exum Mountaineering School. And then the next day after that, and I'm sure they would be shocked to hear this because they would never do this today, we wanted to go do something with our newfound skills, my brother and I, and we hooked up with 2 other guys or kids that were about the same age as us, and Exum loaned us a rope. And they loaned us some gear, and we went up and we climbed this thing called Ice Point. And Ice Point is a very, very, very easy little peak above Cascade Canyon and right next to Storm Point. And I came back from that trip and went to the local mountaineering shop in town, Western Mountaineering, and bought myself a gold line rope and some other gear, and that was the beginning of the end.
The age of 16.
Yep.
I find it interesting, when you grow up on the East Coast, for example, I find parents, they only have like one thing to do, and that's put their kids into like soccer or baseball or American football or basketball. You end up playing a lot of organized sports. But when you grow up on the West Coast, or you grow up, in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, like you spend more time outside and you end up, kind of engaging with nature in a much more meaningful way. And it's funny, the way you grew up is idyllic. I mean, just being outside, being able to go hiking and climbing and having all this nature around you instead of spending, 6, 7 months in snow and winter and freezing.
Well, yeah, and I was born in Detroit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I was born in Detroit, but my parents moved when I was just about 3 years old. And so they've always liked to remind me that if they hadn't moved to California and if we'd stayed in Detroit, that would have been my life.
Yeah, for sure. You would
probably been working at an auto factory or something.
or a retired professional footballer.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. So wow, they moved out at 3 and it changed your whole life basically.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, my mom was pregnant with my brother, and she didn't find out until they had moved, and she told me that if she had found out prior to that, they probably wouldn't have moved.
Wow, that's crazy.
So very, very fortuitous for me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, were you playing any other sports, or were you just like, nah, I just love the outdoors?
I was kind of a nerdy, geeky kid. When I was young, I played in the band. I played
what instrument?
Trumpet. Yeah, and that's because my dad played the trumpet, and so I started doing that. My brother played the trombone, but I played a little bit of baseball. I really wasn't, like a sports type of kid. I was, super skinny, glasses, kind of nerdy. Really wasn't, sports really wasn't my thing.
Yeah. But then climbing on that wall somehow spoke to you.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really cool. I think it was a way for me to do something that was different because, back in the 70s, climbing was considered to be this sport for crazy people.
Still is maybe, right?
Well, maybe, but I think it's a lot more mainstream these days. I mean, if you look at how many, climbing gyms are around and stuff like that, it's a pretty mainstream activity these days. But back then, yeah, it was, you were, a drug-laden hippie if you were, a climber.
And you grabbed that reputation and loved it?
Yeah, I did.
So if you are so into the outdoors and you love rock climbing, like what did you do when you were 16, 17, 18? Like, did you climb as much as you could on the weekends? Did you want to go to college or did you just want to climb? Like, how do you even start climbing at 16? I mean, you don't even have a car, right? Like, where do you have to go to climb living in San Jose?
Yeah, so there's some spots just above town. So there's Castle Rock, which is maybe 30 minutes away, and that's right above town. There's Pinnacles National Monument, which is about 2 hours away. And then, of course, Yosemite is only 4 hours away. And so it's a great question because I ended up kind of falling in with some older climbers who had cars.
As you do.
One of the guys, his name was Rocco, which I kind of find is funny. And another guy by the name of Robert, who were both, I don't even really know, but I would guess probably about 4 or 5 years older than me. And so I kind of fell in with them. They had a car, and so we would go out and do stuff together. But yeah, for me, it turned into something that I wanted to do as much as possible. I daydreamed about it in school, so I would be sitting in class and, making lists of places that I wanted to go and climbs I wanted to do. And it was really kind of a weird thing because I just went from not really knowing anything about it to, just being, that's all I wanted to do.
What are your reference points at this stage? Like, because there's no internet, right? Like you can't sit down and in front of a computer and type in stuff and watch, YouTube videos of other people doing stuff. Like, how do you even learn what's out there?
Yeah. So there were 2 books that were pretty formative. There was Advanced Rockcraft and Basic Rockcraft by Royal Robbins. Those were pretty formidable books that, they're not that big, but they talked about, kind of the basics. But really back then, it was all trial and error, which is, why I'm kind of amazed that I'm still alive, because, you don't have a lot of opportunities for error and to, continue living.
Yeah. Because, you make mistakes up there and it's over, right?
Yeah. So I'd go to the local outdoor shop, Western Mountaineering. I'd, peruse other books and stuff that were there. But really it was all trial and error, a couple of books, and talking to like these older friends of mine who had done more stuff.
And where did you meet these older friends? Like, were there events? I mean, how do you even because they're again, the way we communicate and connect today is so totally different. Like, were people putting up like little flyers at the local mountaineering shop being like, hey, who wants to go climbing on Saturday?
Yeah, I think that was the case, but frankly, I don't really remember how I met those two guys, but it had to have been some way, shape, or form at the outdoor shop.
Because I remember back in the day, like going to outdoor shops and stuff like that, and seeing people who were like looking for traveling partners who were going to go to like India or try to do some climbing there, and they would put up little flyers and stuff like that, because there were no books to advertise in, and there was no internet, and that was like the only way to like meet people.
Yep, and that's like in Yosemite, the bulletin board at Camp 4. That used to be kind of the center of the universe, because if you were in Yosemite, by yourself and you were looking for a partner, that was where you went to find a partner.
How scary is it climbing with someone you've never met before, though? Because like I've done some climbing, and I definitely prefer to know the person on the other end of that rope and trust them, right? It's funny to me that people would just kind of show up as singles and then just find people to climb with.
Yeah. And no, that's totally true. I mean, these days I'm way selective with who I climb with. It's very rare for me to climb with someone that I don't know pretty well. I have a very kind of small set of friends, that I climb with. Right now, the guy that I'm going to be in Yosemite with next week, he and I have been climbing together for 45 years, something like that.
Trustworthy.
Yeah, but back then, again, I don't think we knew any better. We were just learning the sport. We were getting out and trying to climb as much as possible. And, a lot of, there weren't a lot of options. So most of the time we were climbing with folks that we might have only met that morning.
Mm. And does a young aspiring climber, does he go to university?
I did, and that was...
How much did you hate that?
I did. So I kind of flunked out my first year. So that was just an expectation that my parents had. And so, I didn't want to disappoint them, I guess. And so I got out of high school and ended up at Chico. And the first day that I got there, my parents dropped me off. I checked into the dorm.
Sorry, what's Chico?
Chico State University up in Northern California.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I checked into my dorm room, and back then the climbing shoes of the day were EBs, and so I had heard that there was this bouldering traverse on the engineering building at Chico. And so I'm walking across the parking lot with my EBs and my chalk bag. And these two guys pulled up in this car and they're like, "You must be a climber." Turns out it's my friend Steve, who I'm climbing with next week, and another friend of ours, Rick. And they're like, and so we chatted a little bit, and they're like, "We're going to Yosemite. You want to go?" I'm thinking, why not? I don't have anything really better to do. And so I ended up going to Yosemite, fell in with Steve and Rick and a number of other guys. And that first semester at Chico, I think we spent probably 3 to 5 days a week in Yosemite.
Oh, really?
I wasn't going to classes. And so at the end of the semester, thinking that maybe I could just wing it and, pass some classes, I went to the finals. I had, physics, calculus. I don't remember what else, but
I love the confidence though. It's like I haven't been to class all semester, but I'll be fine.
yeah, exactly. And so I went, and so that semester I ended up with a C, a D, and 2 Fs. And my parents were like, "What the?" And they're like, "We're not paying for that again." And so that was my one and only semester at Chico.
I like this though, because like I guess you probably didn't want to go to university, but you had expectations, so then you went, but then you met a couple of your best friends,
Yeah.
and then you got out. I love that.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing with it is I think I got an A+ in the Yosemite School of Crack Climbing that semester. So I did learn a lot, but yeah,
In the wrong place.
yeah, exactly.
So at like 19, 20, academic learning is no longer for you. So what are you trying to get out of the world?
Well, so my what I wanted to do ever since I can remember was be a park ranger. I like the idea of being outdoors. I like the idea of being a ranger, and so there was a program close to my parents at one of the junior colleges. It was a park management degree. And so after Chico, I came back, lived at home, and I went to this through this 2-year program to become a park ranger. And in the process, during the summers, I ended up with a job as a climbing ranger in Grand Teton National Park.
Well, that's interesting. What's a climbing ranger? What, you're just going up, like saving people who get stuck?
That's part of the job. So there's a ranger station there. At the time, anyone that wanted to climb in the range had to register with the Park Service. Okay. And so the goal of the Park Service was to have rangers that knew the routes, knew the conditions, were able to help folks, be safe. We were also responsible for doing patrols in some of the canyons. But the cool thing is we had usually 2 days a week where we did what's called a mountain patrol. And a mountain patrol is, again, it's just that. We needed to learn what the routes were like, conditions on the route, so that we could share that with other climbers. And so as a young climber, I mean, what could be better? I mean, I was climbing probably 4 to 5 days a week and getting paid for it.
Oh my God, that's a dream job. Yeah,
it was a dream job. And obviously, if there were rescues, we were the rescue team, and so we did quite a lot of rescues. And so I kind of credit the Tetons, because I was primarily a rock climber. I grew up in the Bay Area, climbing in the Pinnacles, climbing in the Tetons. Climbing in Yosemite. The Tetons taught me a number of things. Number one, I learned more about mountaineering there, kind of rock and ice type of mountaineering. But I also saw from a lot of the rescues that I was involved in what people did wrong.
Sure, yeah. I bet you must have seen a bunch of horror shows out there.
Exactly. And so I feel like that was pretty formative for me from the standpoint that I was able to, learn quite a bit and avoid the mistakes that, other folks, made.
It's interesting. So, I mean, like, I guess the way we look at things now is totally different. Like, I guess climbers can get sponsored. Climbers can, coach people or act as guides, and you can advertise all these skills on the internet. But here you are, like young 18, 19, you love climbing. There's no real way to earn money climbing, but you found a way to earn money and keep climbing, in the most kind of just in a total analog kind of way where you found the job and you kind of got into it. And I mean, what were your other climbing buddies doing at this stage? Like, did they get normal jobs and they were just climbing on the weekends? Because I feel like you figured it out.
A lot of them, I would say, dropped out, and they just climbed full time.
Like dropped out of society,
dropped out of school, and they just scraped by so that they could climb as much as possible. And I think I credit my parents. that wasn't their expectation for their kids, and so I kind of, I guess I kind of, wanted to please them and actually have a job. So for me, it was, the best thing that I could, possibly do. It was really hard to do that. The first year that I got hired in the Tetons, there were 200 applications for 2 spots.
Oh my God, is that much competition?
Yeah, because again, get paid to go climbing. What could be better? And so yeah, it was very, very competitive, and a lot of the folks that were applying had mountaineering experience. They were ideally looking for someone that had more technical rock climbing experience, and so I had that from my years. Well, not a lot of years, but a couple of years climbing in Yosemite and doing big walls, which is kind of what I love to do.
And I mean, how do you? I mean, so again, you apply to a job offer in the Tetons. So we're in it's Wyoming, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're in San Jose.
Yep.
And you're writing to these, to this national park saying like, hey, I'm your guy. I've climbed these walls. Like, no one can call. Like, how can you prove any of that?
Yeah. Well, I think
you could have showed up on day one and not known anything.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I mean, I don't know how much they would have checked stuff out or really been able to check anything out. I mean, it was a formal application process. It wasn't just cold calling or writing somebody. So it was a formal application process, and it just worked out.
And what were you feeling about your early mountaineering experiences? Because it's obviously completely different than rock climbing.
Yeah, I didn't have a lot of mountaineering experience. I ice climbed a little bit over in Lee Vining, climbed in Mount Shasta up in Northern California. That was really the extent of my mountaineering experience at that time. But just because it was the big climbing umbrella, it felt like it was the right thing to do, and I was excited to learn a little bit more about mountaineering and kind of pursue that.
Yeah, it's a totally different discipline. It's a wild one, especially when you get into the ice and the crampons and the ice axes and stuff. It can be a lot of fun.
Yep.
And incredibly daunting.
Yes.
So what did you do after the Tetons job? I mean, how long did that last? It sounded like a gravy situation for you. You could just work on your climbing and still make a living, and your parents didn't know exactly what you were doing every day.
Yeah. It was a seasonal job, so I was working on the other rest of the year as in retail. I was working for the North Face, working in retail stores, managing retail stores, doing some product testing for North Face back then. But, kind of what came to a head, and this is something that either I wasn't paying attention or they never talked about when I went through the park management program. But if you wanted to be a permanent ranger, which is ideally what I wanted to pursue, they needed you to be have a law enforcement commission.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah. And so, I was like, if you're going to get a law enforcement commission, that means you're going to have to carry a gun. And if you're going to have to carry a gun, you may be expected to use it. And I'm like, I didn't get into that for this, and for that reason. And so it kind of came to this head where, yeah, I could continue to work seasonally, but I was also working at the North Face at the time, and I liked that side of it, the kind of the business side of it as well. And so I finally got a job offer as for a full-time job with the North Face, and I ended up kind of I got to that junction that a lot of folks get in their lives where you go one route or go the other route, and because I was really pretty against the law enforcement commission. And even though I loved, working seasonally, I decided to take a job with the North Face full time.
And that brought you back to San Francisco, the Bay Area?
Yeah, I was living in the Bay Area at the time. So, I mean, I was going out to the Tetons during the summers. I'd work typically from around mid-May to the end of October. And then, I was back in the Bay Area anyway, the rest of the year.
And what was it like kind of giving up that life in the mountains for regular work and the business life?
It's still, I was still climbing a lot. So, I do enjoy the business side of things. And so it was pretty exciting for me still as well.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, so where did your climbing progress and where did your climbing kind of take you after you left the park service?
Yeah. So, it kind of put on hold bigger trips. And so, prior to that, because I was working seasonally, I was also able to take, a month or two off at a time. And, I did early trips to the Himalayas and trips up in Alaska and places like that. As soon as I got a full-time job, like most people, they get a full-time job, right? Kind of those opportunities for big chunks of time went away, and so I kind of went through this period of time for, I want to say maybe 3 or 4 years where, I was just, climbing, short trips, and really working on my technical skills and getting stronger and climbing harder, but not really the big trips and expedition type of stuff.
So where did you go? I mean, where'd you go in the Himalayas, for example? Because I've been all through that part of the world.
Yeah, so in 1985, my partner John and I went to India. That was the first trip that I did to the Himalayas. We went to an area in the Himalayas called the Garhwal. And the Garhwal is kind of north central India. We were trying to take what we knew from climbing on big walls in Yosemite to the Himalayas.
And how did that work out?
It didn't. We were in way over our heads, but it goes back to this. Yvon Chouinard made a statement back in the, I don't know, late 70s, early 80s, that the future of Yosemite climbing was taking those skills that we've learned in Yosemite to the greater ranges of the world. And so, we were kind of abiding by Yvonne's statement and trying to do exactly that. And so we're like, we're big wall climbers. We've done a lot of big walls. We've done, a bunch of mountaineering type of stuff. How hard could it be? Well, we learned the hard way that, that the logistics side of things, the gear side of things, for an expedition like that in extreme weather and at altitude, there's similarities, but there's a lot of differences as well. So, I mean, overall, we didn't get very far on that trip, but we learned a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a really cool trip for us.
There's nothing better in this world than going out into the unknown and just getting slammed, right? Like, just because at least you put it out there and tried.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done a lot of climbing or mountaineering all around the world, and we made TV shows about it and stuff like that too. And I remember, just showing up kind of mentally unprepared for the incredible task that we've just assigned ourselves to. And plus we had to try to film it. So the gear, the logistics, the weather, batteries, all these things, having to take all this into consideration was always very difficult.
Yeah, it is a different ball game, and there's a lot of experience that comes into play with that. So I've, since then I've climbed in Nepal and I've climbed in Pakistan. I've learned a lot, especially on that early trip, and over the years, it's really been important.
Yeah, I mean, have you been happy with the way that climbing has been seen, by people who don't climb, like by the general public, like in the time that you've been a climber? Because the perception of the way you were treated when you were 18 is much different than now, right? I mean, have you been pleased with how it's kind of become mainstream, or do you miss the days when everyone thought you guys were, criminals?
I don't know if I would say I'm pleased or not pleased. I mean, I think
There's a lot more money in the business now.
there's definitely a lot more money available in it. But, like I said, back in the day, everyone was considered to be lunatics. These days, it's so much more mainstream that, the questions that we used to get, back in the day are the same but different as we get today. I think that the cool thing with climbing is that it's such an amazing activity, and from a photography standpoint or movie standpoint, I always say one of the things about climbing is it's kind of like real estate. It's all about location, 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 and you get into some amazing locations, and it's amazing with the film technology and stuff today. People can be really brought into that and kind of experience it virtually.
Yeah,
It doesn't really answer your question, I guess.
No, it is interesting. I mean, 'cause I think the thing I'm most interested in is whenever you meet people who have had as long a climbing career as you have, for example, you got into climbing for very specific, very personal reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering, like, as you've seen a lot of attention come to the industry, and as you've seen technology change and people using that technology to promote themselves and things like that, have you seen like people come into this climbing space, for reasons that you didn't really think were very interesting, or you felt were very, very different than why you got into climbing?
Yeah, definitely. It's funny you asked that question because Sonny and I had this conversation recently.
It's the old school versus the new school, right?
Well, this was the conversation that Sonny and I were having, which is, are you doing it for the right reasons? And does it really matter what the reasons are that you're doing it for? I do it for very personal reasons. I see a lot of folks that, they get into climbing and they have a goal of climbing 514, say. They get to 514, they're good, they're done, they move on to something else. Is that bad? Not necessarily, but it's a different reason for climbing. They have a specific grade, or they have a specific film or movie or number of followers or whatever it might be to get to, and then they move on to something else. And that's great. Everyone should do what makes them happy and what's personally satisfying to them. For me, climbing is deeply personal. I feel like I do it for the right reasons. And growing up climbing in the 70s and the 80s, there was a lot of talk about doing it, for the right reason. That was the ethic, back in the day.
I can imagine back in the 70s and 80s, you might show up to Yosemite at El Cap and be alone. And now you show up at El Cap and there's like 100 people there. Because climbing has become much more mainstream and much more accepted, you must have a lot of people out there, when you're trying to do your thing too. It can probably be very crowded in a lot of places.
Yeah, that's very true. Climbing on El Cap in the 70s and the 80s in particular, if there were other parties on the wall, we knew them. They were friends of ours. These days, I still run into people I know. I've been climbing long enough, and I'm in Yosemite, a couple times a year to climb on El Cap, that I've developed this network of, friends that are, young up and coming climbers to, the old curmudgeons, like myself. And so I have this pretty broad friend network, and so that's kind of cool because, I think one of the, I guess this is a little bit of an aside, I think one of the things that's missing from the sport these days is kind of a really good network, mentoring network.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that, because everyone's just kind of off doing their own thing, right?
Yeah. And if you look at, mountaineering in Europe, they have very defined mentoring programs. Climbing in the U.S. just doesn't have that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Europe is very, very different.
Yeah.
And the way they kind of work together and the way they bring up younger climbers and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's starting to happen a little bit. The American Alpine Club has tried to take a lead there. There's different organizations like Steve House's organization that does that. But yeah, it's something that's needed in this sport.
Did working for the North Face kind of help you at all in your climbing? I mean, because everyone knows the North Face as this massive clothing company and they sponsor the most amazing athletes all around the world. But what was it like when you worked there? Because that was pre, all the marketing that we see today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when folks think about gear companies, they're all like, oh, we want to do gear testing. That's a way to get, free gear. These days, there isn't really necessarily much of a need for that. But back then, there was a little bit more of a need for that. And so my kind of connection into the North Face, I was very good friends with a woman who was the director of product for the North Face. And so, I always got, free gear from them. And, these days, getting gear is, kind of an easier thing to do. Getting money, is really hard. But here's the thing, gear isn't cheap, and so, pretty much throughout my career, because I've been involved in the outdoor industry, I've gotten, tens and tens of thousands of dollars worth of free gear that I would have otherwise had to have paid for. And that makes a difference.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, so how long did you work at the North Face, and did you kind of quit and go back into your, expedition mode?
Yeah. So I worked for the North Face for about 3 years, and I really wanted to get out of California. I was in the Bay Area. I kind of feel like as a kid, most kids want to kind of unfold their wings and go somewhere different.
Really just let it rip.
From where they grew up. And, when I was in the Tetons, at the end of the season every year, I'd typically go down to Boulder, Colorado and the desert Southwest, chill out for a couple of weeks before I, kind of started my next gig. And I really like Colorado a lot, and especially Boulder, Colorado. It's, climbing mecca, just the diversity and the access to, rock climbing, trad climbing, sport climbing, alpine climbing, mountaineering. It's got it all in a very close proximity. So I really like that area a lot. And so after 3 years working with the North Face, and I was managing stores for the North Face, I had a job opportunity that took me to Boulder, and I was pretty excited about that.
That's epic. So you took the job opportunity just basically so you could climb in Boulder, Colorado.
Exactly.
How we make the toughest decisions in life. Yeah.
Well, if that job had been in, Cincinnati or, wherever, it wouldn't have happened.
And I mean, did you have the chance to do any other international expeditions, in between any of that time?
Yeah. So, so once I moved to Colorado, the funny thing is the job that I had moved there for fell through.
Oh no.
Yeah. So, I was been offered a job as a product manager for Low Alpine Systems, and I was going to do some contract work for them for a couple of months until their next fiscal year started. And their parent company, right before the fiscal year started, my position got a red line through it. And so now all of a sudden I'm in Colorado, I don't have a job. And so I started, I had an opportunity to start as a sales rep. And so I started repping for some outdoor brands. These days, being a sales rep is a, kind of a 12-month-a-year job. Back then, sales repping was, call it more of a seasonal job. And so, I could work really hard for a bunch of months, and then I could take off a month or two. And so I did a number of expeditions up to Alaska, climbing up in Alaska, and it also allowed me to spend a lot of time climbing on El Cap.
That's great. It's funny that you, like, as much as you traveled and explored and done kind of mountaineering and climbing in other parts of the world, you've always kind of gone back to Yosemite.
It's interesting to me that Yosemite feels like home to me. Every time I go there, there's, I don't know how to describe it, but there's this vibe that, I'm coming home, even though, the valley has changed so much over the last, 47 years that I've climbed there. As much as things changed, they also stay the same. And so I really feel like home climbing Yosemite. I just absolutely love being there.
And so living in Boulder, did that kind of, did your climbing get better in Boulder just because you had access to so many different kind of variations of climbing? And then, where did you want to take your climbing after all those different experiences?
Yeah, so my climbing definitely improved quite a bit. I mean, I was in my, early to mid 30s, kind of peak, kind of fitness from a sport climbing standpoint with the easy access. I really worked on getting better and better. And so I would have to say that period in my life was when I was climbing the hardest, from a rock climbing and a sport climbing standpoint. So, that was a great time frame for me for that, and just because of the accessibility.
And did you have to put together a whole new crew in Colorado because all your Yosemite guys were still in California? So, like, was it hard kind of moving and getting plugged into this new network of climbers?
The climbing community was still relatively small back then, and so I plugged pretty quickly into the community, just because as a rep, as an example, I was repping different climbing brands as well, and so that kind of by default exposed me to other climbers. And so I ended up with a pretty small group of regular climbing partners. And it didn't seem to take long for me to do that.
I always have this idea that, people are climbing in Colorado, people are climbing in Yosemite. And, at the end of the climb, they're like, oh, great climb today. It's like, when are we going to go to Nepal? When are we going to go to Morocco? When are we going to go down to Argentina? Like, there's this idea of, like, again, using the skills that you're practicing there to use it as a way of traveling. I mean, did you still want to continue with that bug of kind of using your climbing to explore the world, or were you just kind of happy improving your skills locally?
There's so many places to climb in the world these days.
Oh, I know. I've got a I've got a list.
Yeah. It's just a couple miles long, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And so for me, climbing internationally was, a really cool thing. It was also expensive and took a lot of time. And I would say that I've never been a, financially well-off climber. And so, doing those big trips was hard. It was, rack up the credit cards, that sort of thing. But there are a lot of areas, in the U.S. Also to climb. And so, for me, and I've always had this goal every year, and I've been successful at it, which is every year I've always wanted to climb at least 3 new areas that I've never climbed at before.
Oh, that's a really good way of looking at it.
Yeah. So I've been consistent with that. I'm at 2 so far for this year, and it's what is it, May?
It just
early May. Yeah. So I've got 2 new areas that I'd never climbed in before over my birthday weekend a couple weeks ago, and so yeah, I'd love to get out and do international stuff. It's harder to do that.
Yeah.
Now, as I've gotten older, I have been able to find, the time to do stuff. And I quit my job, when I was, let's see, I guess I was, 58 years old. I quit my job and lived on the road for a couple of years, and that allowed me to, do kind of a bunch of international things that I'd been, kind of wanting to do for years.
Wow, that's a huge gap we just have now between living in Boulder and then quitting your job and exploring the van life. I mean, we'll get back to that in a sec. But when I was talking to Sunny, she mentioned that I should definitely ask you about Baffin Island. If you want to get into it, is that something that you want to chat about?
Sure.
Yeah. One of your international adventures.
Yeah, that was an international adventure, and it's one that folks probably know me, most for. And so Baffin Island, didn't really ever know that much about it other than, the kind of some of the main peaks in Pinkerton, in that area, which is kind of South Baffin Island.
So we're talking about like Arctic Canada here, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So
I don't think anyone knows anything about Arctic Canada.
Yeah.
Definitely not Canadians.
So that area is, if you think of where Greenland is, Baffin Island is to the west of Greenland. It's the 5th largest island in the world. So as a wall climber, again, always, looking for big cliffs to climb, I came across some photos in National Geographic from a gentleman who had been up there exploring, flew around in a plane, and got these amazing photos of these incredibly tall, big walls on the east coast of Baffin Island, about halfway up the east coast. So a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle. And, I saw these photos and I was like, holy cow, those are amazing. That would be, when you think about that statement that Yvonne made about, taking Yosemite climbing to the greater ranges of the world, that looked to be, the perfect spot to go.
And how old were you at this stage? Are these your Boulder, Colorado days?
Yeah, so I was 35 at the time. And I had a friend of mine that I knew kind of peripherally in Yosemite, Rick Lovelace, and he and I had never climbed together before. I knew him by reputation. He knew me by reputation. And I don't remember exactly how it came about, but we started to talk about, potentially doing a trip like this and going up there and checking out these big walls. So I'm going to abbreviate the story a bit because it's a pretty long and convoluted story, but we ended up getting a grant from the American Alpine Club. It's called the Mug Stump grant. Actually, it's not from the American Alpine Club, excuse me. It's from a number of different companies that put in for it. It was called the Mug Stump Award, and Mug Stump was a prolific climber. Friend of mine actually died in a crevasse fall in Alaska, and this kind of climbing grant for small, remote expeditions was formed, and we applied for it and got the grant to go to Baffin Island. Didn't cover all of our costs, but credit cards covered the rest.
It's amazing how expensive it is climbing in the Arctic or doing anything in the Arctic, because I filmed in a few places above the Arctic Circle, and it is prohibitively expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive, and here we are, kind of dirtbag climbers. I'm working as a rep, not making much money, but we figured out how to put it together. And basically our goal was to go into this very remote region that had only seen I think 2 or 3 non-Inuit folks go into before. And so our goal was to go in, do a climb, and then we were planning to be on one side of this fjord, and we were going to hike back after the climb to the last village, which was about 80 miles away. So
just a quick 80 miles.
Just a quick 80 miles. So what's interesting is that so this is one of the eastern fjords, and the ice or the water up there freezes in the winter, right? Salt water. That's amazing that it freezes, and it freezes up to 6 feet thick.
Oh my God!
So you'll have ice that's 6 feet thick. And so we flew up there, we had hired an outfitter that took us by snowmobile about 100 miles north of a village called Clyde River, pulling a sled, a big, long sled, and took us about 100 miles north and into, it's called Samford Fjord, into the fjord. And our original objective was this peak called Kagudi, which is one of the first peaks that you see when you come into the fjord. But unfortunately, some climbers had just climbed that like a couple months earlier. There was a really obvious line on it. We wanted to climb that. So we reverted to plan B, which was on the opposite side of this fjord, okay? On the north side of the fjord, and there was this thing called Walker Citadel. And Walker Citadel is just an amazing chunk of granite, 4,000 feet high, okay? El Capitan's 3,000 feet at its highest part. You know, the right side of El Cap is 2,000 feet, so twice as tall as the right side of El Cap. And so as we were going in, though, you know, what we were noticing is that there was a lot of water on top of the sea ice, and it worried us a little bit. We're like, you know, and this was in early June. And there's what's called the breakup. And the breakup typically doesn't happen until July, August. So we expected that we were going to have at least 4 weeks to be able to climb and then be able to travel on the ice, because during the breakup, there's too much ice to get in by boat and not enough ice to travel by snow machine. And so, you know, there's not a lot of travel that happens during that breakup time frame. And so we were worried about all the water on top of the sea ice. We got to a camp that we made across the bay from Walker Citadel, and we set up camp. Our guide, Joshua, he slept on the sled that night. And, you know, before we went to sleep, Rick and I were like, you know, with all this water on top of the sea ice, we should probably talk to Joshua in the morning and come up with a plan B. You know, how are we going to get out of here if the ice melts early this year? And so in the morning then, all of a sudden we heard the snow machine fire up and Joshua left.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we're like, we didn't have a chance. He didn't say goodbye. We didn't have a chance to talk to him. He just fired up the snow machine and left. And we're like, okay.
That's not how you're supposed to be a guide.
No. And you know, so the other part of this is, you know, as two broke climbers, we decided not to bring a sat phone. You know, this is back in 95, so, you know, sat phones were still pretty expensive back then. You know, I think it was going to cost us $1,500 or $2,000 to rent a sat phone for a trip, and we're like,
yeah,
you know, it's one of those things. Do we buy food or do we take a sat phone? You know, and we decided, you know, that food was more important than a sat phone. So we had zero communication with the outside world at that point. We're, you know, a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle in a very, very remote spot that pretty much no one had ever been to before. So,
and your guide just fucked off.
Yeah. And you know, part of the reason we got the grant was because of the exploratory nature of this trip, because so few folks had been into this area before. You know, it was really exploratory. And so, long story short, we spent a bunch of days shuttling gear across the ice. And one of the things that we noted, and if you think about, is that, you know, this is the ocean, right? It's a big fjord that goes into, and where we were was a little spur off of the main fjord, is that there's tidal action, right? So the tide goes up, comes down. And so there would be cracks in the ice that at low tide, you know, would be together, and at high tide would be spread apart.
Oh, interesting. I never even thought of that.
The other thing, though, that really kind of screwed with us is that the ice next to the walls, because these walls came straight into the ocean, the ice next to the walls, because the you know, tidal action of going up and down would get broken up really quickly. And we started to see that early on. We're like, you know, we'll deal with it as we need.
So hold on just one sec. Let's go back. So you hire an outfitter, you get into this super remote part of Banffin Island. you go to plan B because plan A, someone just climbed. So you're on plan B, which is this citadel. You're camped out next to this fjord, which is next to the wall you want to climb. And then your guide leaves you. You have no contact with the outside world. So at this stage, are you still even thinking about doing your climb, or are you just like, let's get the fuck out of here?
No, I mean, we're there. I mean, we're there to climb, so,
With guide or no guide, it doesn't matter.
Well, and he was more transportation than a guide per se, right? But the whole idea around this, just to be clear, is that we were going to do the climb. We were going to come back down. We were going to stash all of our big wall gear because that stuff's heavy, right? We've got, hundreds of, pounds of big wall gear, pitons and carabiners and, cams and such. And so we were going to stash it at our camp, and then we were going to hike back to Clyde River. Now, our original climb was on the south side of the fjord, and Clyde River is to the south. Now we're on the north side of the fjord. So what that means is we have to walk across the sea ice about 15 miles to get to where we, kind of pick up where there's this old hunting trail that would get us back to Clyde River.
So that whole idea of having to then do the climb and then recross the ice was the weak point.
That, you could say, was a little bit of a faux pas on our part. Mm-hmm. And so, we started up the climb. We thought the climb would take us maybe 2 weeks after we, kind of had fixed the initial pitches. So we had about 2 weeks worth of food with us. Turns out that the whole climb took us up and down 23 days. So, let's just say we were on half food rations for quite a while. Not eating a lot. Part of the reason why it took so long is we had really bad weather most of the time. And really bad weather didn't mean like, a lot of heavy snow or rain or anything like that. Remember, we're at sea level, obviously. It meant wind. And what would happen is the wind would come screaming off of the fjord. We were, our shelter was a portaledge. So, hanging ledge that we would hang from our anchors on the wall. And we, I think, one time had 2 days in a row that we could climb. The rest of the time, the other 23 days that we were on the wall for, we, would climb a day, have a storm day, climb a day, storm day, storm day, storm day, climb it, and so we had a lot more storm days where we're unable to climb. And, you can climb in rain and snow. Climbing in wind is tricky. Because, the chances of you hanging up a rope by having it blow sideways, something like that, is pretty great.
So what's it like on a portaledge on a big wall in the middle of a storm?
We kind of fondly called it being in the washing machine.
Because, just bouncing all over the place.
Yeah, it would bounce all over the place. You would get updrafts that would, two guys and gear, would lift us up, and then drop you back onto the anchors. So, and it's a 4 foot by 6 foot ledge. Now we had a custom ledge that we had, a friend of ours had made for us. We had a black rain fly on the ledge because it's light 24 hours a day. So we had a black fly to try to, block out the sun so we could sleep, block out the light so we could sleep. But it's like being in a washing machine.
People just don't understand how volatile and how dangerous the weather is above the Arctic Circle. Yeah. Like something really does amp up everything.
Yeah, and especially when, these fjords, because like I said, they just kind of funnel the wind, down these fjords. So I would say about 17 or 18 days in, we had one day that was a particularly significant wind event. And what we noticed is on that day, after that day, is that there was a significant amount of ice melt down in the fjord. And if you saw photos that I have, you would look down and it looked like the ice started about 20 or 30 feet out from the base of the climb. In other words, there wasn't any ice. We had started on, right off the ice, and the wall came into the ocean, and there was no ice at the base. So I get a lot of questions about, well, why didn't you guys bail? I mean, figure out, well, we were committed to doing the climb, and we talked incessantly about this, but at the end of the day, we're like, we're here to do the climb. Let's finish the climb, and we'll just deal with things, on the back end.
Yeah, it's tough to cut and run once you're in the middle of something, isn't it?
Yeah. And I've always been, I think one of the things about climbing, and especially big wall climbing, is kind of the problem-solving aspect of it. It's a craftsman activity. There's a lot of problem solving that comes into play there. So,
and just managing all the logistics and being in a remote place, it's so difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, and the logistics, like you said, I mean, those are pretty significant. So there is this major wind event, and we're looking down. We're like, there's no ice down there. We're coming up with these cockamamie ideas for maybe we can swim it. Of course, it's ocean water in the in the Arctic. We have our portaledge, plus we have this big, like 20-gallon barrel that we're hauling water in because, we had, I think, something like 50 gallons of water because we were on a vertical wall. There's no ledges that collected snow, we had to carry all of our water with us. And we're like, maybe we can make a raft with our portaledge and the water barrel, type of thing. So we had all these, like ideas, most of them, crazy ideas for how to deal with that.
So how much, so on day 20 of your 23-day climb, you're looking down and being like, we might have difficulties getting out of this. I mean, how much water would you have had to get through before you could safely get back onto the ice?
It looked to us to be like about 30 to 40 feet of water, which is quite a ways.
And that's also...
And who knows, how thick that ice is,
right?
In the middle. And then once you're on it, you got to get off it again on the other side, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it was one of those things where we just kept on being like, we'll deal with it as we get there, and come up with that. So we summited on our 21st day. Thinking after, so about 7 days longer than we expected. And this is a kind of a standalone pillar, if you will. And so really the only way to get off of it that we saw was to come back down the same way that we had climbed. And so, the last day we had left all of our gear down at our last anchor, climb to the top, and then come back down to our bivouac. And then it took us 2 more days of rappelling to get down. And so we got down to this huge ledge we had called Mastodon Terrace. And our idea for getting off was to try to traverse off to the side because we were in this big bay. So our idea was to try to traverse as far as we could off to the side to get to what looked like, dry land.
That's crazy. So you had started your climb on the ice, climbing up a seawall, and when you came back down, there was no more ice. So you were literally stuck on the wall, and there was no land that you could even get to. So you had to traverse across the rock to get to like a beach.
Yeah. And so that actually worked out for us. We were able to traverse on these little ledges. Ledges would stop. Then we would set up a rappel to a lower ledge, traverse on that. It would stop, rappel. So after a day of doing that, we got down to a final spot. And at this point, it's this huge wind event that's going on. My pack at that point probably weighed about 80 pounds. I had about 80 pounds, all of our wall gear and stuff, between Rick and I. And I set my pack down on this ledge because there were 2 different options for us to get down the last little bit. And I set my pack down on the ledge, started to go over to check out this one option. and we had this huge wind gust that came through, literally picked up my 80-pound pack and tossed it off the cliff and into the ocean. I see it like splash into the ocean. I'm like, holy shit, I just lost all of my gear. And so I scrambled down, and the wind action and also the wave action was so severe that my pack didn't immediately sink, and it got kind of blowing, with the waves kind of close to the shore, where I was able to wade out to about thigh deep, grab my pack, and now we're on dry ground.
But 80 pounds just picked it up and threw it.
Yeah, it was a crazy. And the unfortunate thing about it is that, this is back in, film days. I had a lot of film. It was in a Ziploc bag, but I lost probably 60% of my photos from the climb because the Ziploc bag leaked. And, and so that was really unfortunate. But we were able to get to dry ground, and then we traversed, and it was pretty technical traverse. Took us another full day to get all the way around to the other side of the bay, which is where our base camp was and where all of our gear was. And at this point, we're relieved to be down. We figured it out to be down and off the wall. But now our next order of business is, how are we going to get out of here? Because there's no way that anyone could travel in on the sea ice. And so we cooked up this cockamamie idea that, and looking at the map, and the maps at the time were very primitive, if you will, because most of that area was unexplored. To climb about 4,000 feet above our base camp to this glacier, traverse this glacier, get off the glacier, traverse all the way to the bottom of the main fjord, cross the river at that fjord, and then work our way back through some valleys to get back to Clyde River. We figured it was about 180 miles.
Oh, my God.
We're already pretty weak. We'd been, 23 days in the wall and, less than 14 days worth of food. We had maybe, I think, 6 or 7 days of food left at base camp. And we're like, no time like the present. We've got to get out of here. We have no way to communicate with anybody. It doesn't look like, anyone's going to be able to get in to get us because of how early the sea ice melted. And so we loaded up our packs. I think we rested for one day. We loaded up our packs and started climbing about 1,000 feet or 4,000 feet above our camp up to this glacier.
You think the outfitter that dropped you off after like 20 days would have been like, I wonder if those guys are okay.
Yeah. I have no idea what he was thinking. But in these situations, you just have to, fend for yourself, right? And so, we loaded up, all of our gear. We probably had 70-pound packs, for each of us. And we left a note with the rest of our gear with what we were doing. So we left a note, say, hey, this is the route that we're planning to take. So we, of course, hadn't planned to do any glacier travel. So we had a rope. We had one ice axe, no crampons, no crevasse rescue gear, and snowshoes for each of us. That was it. So we ended up getting up on this glacier, and that was pretty epic to cross that, and took us a long time. Long story short, we hiked out about three days, and and after we got off the glacier, one of the things that we were noticing is that we were having to do all these river crossings, and we're doing river crossings at peak melt, so all these raging rivers, and, river crossings can be pretty dicey and pretty dangerous, and they were getting worse and worse. And so we finally got out about 3 days, and our third night camping out, we were finding that, with all the effort we were putting out, with having been with limited food supplies for, days on end on the climb. We were pretty exhausted. We were eating like 2 meals a night, just for us to, kind of maintain our calories. And, so we were about to run out of food on that. Now, we had a shotgun with us because of polar bears. Those are a thing up there, right? Of course, for polar bears, we just had slugs for, ammo. And so not much you can shoot with a slug that's going to, still be around. I mean, we saw, birds and, stuff like that. But so we had kind of a heart-to-heart talk our third night out there. We're like, this is freaking crazy. I think we had only covered maybe 20 some odd miles in 3 days, and we have 180 miles to go, and we're about to run out of food. Mm-hmm. And we're like, okay, what are we gonna do here? What's the smart decision to do here? And one of the things that came into play is the fact that we had left a bunch of our gear back at our camp, expecting our outfitter to pick that up with a note on it. So we're like, what if we get back to our gear and it's gone? Because they came in and now they think we're going out this other way.
So now you have to commit to that trail almost.
Yeah. So we decided that it was just too much of a flyer for us to do that 180 miles. So we turned around and we hiked back, crossed the nasty glacier for 3 days. So we'd been out for about 6 days. We got back to where our camp was. All of our gear was still there. And we reset up the tent, and, we kind of settled in. We had a day's worth of food left. And that was just like a bag of ramen, type of thing. And so we just kind of moved back into the tent, and the day turned into 5 days, and, 5 days turned into 8 days. We've been out of food, really since day after we got back. Mm-hmm. We had found, Rick had found a quail egg. So we made this new flavor of ramen, quail egg ramen. And so we got back. So we were just hanging out in the tent, and we were, just conversing, every day about, kind of what's going on. Why hasn't anyone come and pick us up? Because looking out at our bay there's no ice. It's all water. And so we're like, oh, folks should be able to come in and get us. We missed
by boat.
By boat. We missed our flight. Our flight had already, and I'm like, my parents must have been calling to see, what's going on. And so, 10, 11 days, 12 days goes by, we're feeling pretty emaciated, starting to be pretty lightheaded, have, I don't know if I'd say hallucinations, but maybe, something, akin or close to. And I have this photo that Rick and I took of each other. We must have set the camera up on a rock, standing out in front of the bay, thinking that, well, maybe that's one of our, the last photos of the two of us. Now, I knew that, it takes a long time for someone to, die of starvation, but, and especially if you have water, or, fresh water, and we did have fresh water. There was a stream near us. And, so after 14 days, really 13 days without food or so, we heard a boat come in, and there were 3 Inuit hunters. They'd snuck in around the edge of the ice, had been in the back of the fjord hunting for caribou. They had shot a couple of caribou. They knew that, because they were from Clyde River, they knew that we were in there. They heard that we hadn't, made it out yet, so they came in to check us out and kind of were our saviors. I guess the funny thing about that is up until that point, I'd been a vegetarian. The only thing after 13 days of not eating that I had in front of me was caribou stew, and so I devoured that, and interestingly enough, I didn't get sick at all.
Okay.
So they got us out. Joshua basically made the excuse that he couldn't get in around the ice because while the bay, one of the learnings that we had is, the shallower the water, right, the quicker the ice melted. And so when you went, 30 miles out towards the mouth of the fjord, where it's much deeper, there was still ice out there. But at that point, not a lot. So we still don't know the full story from Jushu or the real story on why he didn't come in, to get us. We just think maybe he was trying to, prove a point or something like that.
I mean, what kind of conversations are you having on day one of having no food? You and your climbing partner, like you're just sitting in a tent trying to stay warm. You're still in the Arctic. You're above the Arctic Circle. Weather's on and off, and you're just like, well, here we are.
There's endless speculation about what was going on. Literally endless conversation about, why isn't anyone here? What's going on? Has the world, kind of blowing up, and we're the only ones left? I mean, you have all those sorts of thoughts. And so that wasn't just day one. That was day 1 through, 14. I mean, 2 weeks worth of those, conversations as we're getting more and more kind of emaciated. At the time, I think I weighed about 165 pounds. When I got back from that trip, I was down around, I think, 147. I'd lost almost 20 pounds from that trip.
I mean, at any stage in that 13 days without food, just sitting on that beach, like, did you guys think that was it? That was going to be the end of it?
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely had that thought, and I was skinnier than Rick, so I was like, I might be the first one to go. But again, just like being on the climb and figuring we'll figure it out, while we did have those thoughts, we also were fairly optimistic that, it would all work out. And I think that's one of the things about, about climbing is like that. I mentioned kind of that craftsman aspect and kind of figuring stuff out. It's all about problem solving. Now, what was most challenging for us is that there was nothing for us to do. Someone else had to figure it out for us. We were not able to self-rescue ourselves. Whereas most situations that I find myself in on expeditions or on El Cap or climbing in general, it's about my own ingenuity, my own creativity, kind of figuring it out on my own. Here, we're just lying there, hoping that someone will figure it out for us.
Must have felt so hopeless.
It did.
Yeah.
That was a really, really weird feeling.
And it's interesting too, because when you get into situations like that where you don't have any food, and I've never been in this situation before, but I could just imagine, and you can maybe confirm or deny this, but like every day that goes by, your body is kind of getting weaker, your mind is getting weaker, and your chance of just managing yourself, taking care of yourself diminishes, right? So if you do have a plan to try to escape, or you do have a plan of gathering food or trying to do, like, every single day you're not eating, whatever ideas you had become further and further away.
Yeah. And that's very true. And I would say that what was interesting to me is that you lose, you have, where you have an appetite, you actually lose it. Like, a couple days in, it's not like your stomach's growling and you're super hungry. You just, you kind of lose that sense of hunger altogether. The other interesting thing about it is you don't eat, you don't poop. Mm-hmm. It was interesting not to poop for 2 weeks.
Was there, obviously you guys went through the gamut of how to survive. Fish in the river, fish in the bay, anything like squirrels. Above the Arctic Circle, it's pretty sparse, that's for sure. Did you guys have any successes about?
So we did, we had a fishing line, just some line and a hook with us. We did a couple days into sitting in the bay, catch this it was like this really kind of spiny, ugly fish. Like, it's the type of fish that you see pictures of that are, from deep, 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 deep in the ocean. And, we caught that thing. And of course, there wasn't any meat or anything on it. But we looked at that thing. And we're like, I don't even know if that thing's safe to eat. And we tossed it back.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know, maybe we weren't hungry enough at that point to try to figure it out. So there wasn't really, so there were ducks and such and seabirds that were out on the water. But again, all we had were slugs,
Mm-hmm.
Even if we were lucky enough to hit one of those, first of all, it would just, probably demolish it. But secondly, if it didn't, it's out in the water.
Right.
How are you going to get it?
Yeah.
Type of thing. So there wasn't really anything on land that we saw that we were able to, to get.
Were you able to have a fire at least?
No, there's no, it's Arctic, it's all talus. There's no trees or wood or anything like that out there.
So there's not even a way of making a fire and signaling or anything, is there?
No. And, we'd see, what's interesting, and you've, I'm sure, experienced this as well, is it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you'll probably see planes. It doesn't matter. You'll be in the most remote spot in the world, you'll see a plane fly by. So we would see, planes occasionally flying above us and such, but there's no one, really to signal to. It's the definition of being off the grid, off the map, and having to, in essence, rely on yourself, but in this instance, rely on others to figure it out and come in and get us.
And you're here to talk, and you're here to tell the story.
Here to tell the story, and, it's interesting because, we did a really cool first ascent of a 4,000-foot big wall above the Arctic. But it's, I always characterize it, I feel like it's like a car race. Folks go to the car race, with the maybe secret goal of seeing a car crash, and so, when I used to do a lot of slideshows and presentations and stuff like that. Everyone wants to hear about that because, we almost died, but there's a bunch of other cool expeditions and trips and climbs that I've done that, get kind of less play.
Mm-hmm. No, it's an incredibly dramatic story.
Yeah.
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 In a remote part of the world.
Yeah. I got a call, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so from the Bear Grylls. What is it? Bear
Grylls, yeah.
Yeah, Bear Grylls, from a producer from them. And, they wanted to talk about potentially doing a, programming, around that trip.
Like recreating the situation?
My understanding of what they do is, kind of recreating a situation, and then, what would Bear Grylls do, in that situation?
With his helicopter over there and his crew of 30. Yeah.
Exactly. And so after I talked to him, I never heard from him again. So it's just one of those things whereby, what could we have done differently? We could have not done the climb, and as soon as we know, like you said at the start, as soon as it was obvious that the sea ice was, breaking up early, we could have figured out a way to bail out of there. We could have hiked across the ice while there was still ice, that 15 miles to get to the south side of the fjord to do that, 80-mile hike back, but, we were there to climb.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an amazing spot. And that's kind of the definition of adventure, is that unknown aspect that, you just kind of launch into that and hope for the best. Sounds naive, but it's more than hope for the best. We had a lot of skills from, some other expeditions and, from other climbs and such that, we felt like we could use there.
And I can't even imagine how amazing it must have felt to be rescued and to have those people come in and feed you and then bring you back to civilization. What was it like getting back to Boulder after that experience and kind of like trying to reintegrate yourself into normal life after having had this life-threatening adventure and kind of you almost lost your life up there.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of interesting. So I got back to Boulder. I was married at the time. My wife had moved out of the house that we were in. And so that was the start of, kind of divorce proceedings, if you will. So that was one of the first things that, that I was greeted to.
Congratulations, you survived your Arctic climb, and I'm gone.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think 2 days. So again, I was working in the outdoor industry as a rep at the time. And so, 2 days after I got back was the big trade show, outdoor retailer trade show. I think it was still in Salt Lake at the time. And so I got back. I'm home for 2 days, and I have to go to the trade show
And get divorced in the 48 hours in between there.
Yeah, it took a little longer, but yeah. So that it's always tough, right? To get reintegrated, just mentally. I was going to say physically for us as well because of how emaciated we were. But mentally to get reintegrated, and then of course now all of a sudden I'm at this trade show with all my peers, and everyone wants to hear the story, and yada yada yada.
Yeah. You ever get tired of telling the story?
Yes and no. I mean, I think it's an interesting story. Like I said, there's other climbs that I would say I'm more proud of to have done than that one.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. That's pretty intense. I mean, I'm sure the other climbs you've done are as worthy a story, but having that life-threatening kind of coming down and not having the land or the ice where you started, it must have just been terrifying.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it kind of goes back to what I like about climbing, just in general, is kind of the unknown aspect, the problem-solving aspect. But the other thing that I think is that climbing really gives you is focus, and so it's one of the things just when I think about when I go out climbing, whether it's aid climbing on El Cap or it's free climbing, for the day, is that absolute focus that you get. You get rid of all those external chatter and conversations that are going on in your head, and you're really focused on, kind of what you're doing. And, when you're on an expedition, and I know you've experienced this, I'm sure as well, is you're just, your day is about, I describe it as your day is about surviving the day. Everything that you do is about staying warm, staying safe, making sure you have enough food, and just survival. I like
nice.
that.
Yeah.
I like that focus, and everything else, all the stuff that, is going on in your life just kind of falls away, and you're just focused on what's a very basic, very primitive, aspect.
That focus is addictive.
Yeah.
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 It's beautiful just to tune out from the rest of the world and just do one thing.
And I think that, as climbing has gotten more popular, folks find that, even at the gym, it's the same thing. It's there's the physical aspect of it, and that kind of workout, which is a full body workout, not just like running where you're working out your legs or something like that. It's a full body workout. But, even in the gym, it's that focus, and how do you do how do you make that next move? And again, I think that folks that are, I was going to say successful, but it's not just folks that are successful. I think just, climbing in general, that focus is really important. And I think that's a good way of putting it, that it's addictive.
Yeah. I think it's super addictive because I think that's why we feel so shitty when we come back to society. I mean, we go out and we do these expeditions, we're offline for 10 or 12 days. We're sleeping in nature. We're living with the natural rhythm of the earth. There's no artificial light. There's no artificial air.
Yeah.
We're really in it. Yeah. And every day we're just trying to get to the next day.
Yeah.
And that rhythm of that survival it brings us back, I think, subconsciously somewhere where we prefer to be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And I mean, I really enjoy that aspect of it. I enjoy, like I said, climbing's like real estate. It's location, 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 So besides all that, you just get into these really outrageous, locations. And that's the thing about climbing on El Cap, I mean, there's only one way for you to get into those outrageous locations, and that's by climbing. And I love being up there in such an improbable spot. And I don't know what it is that I love about it. It's just, it makes me feel really good being in that improbable spot in such, an outrageous location. You're looking down, 3,000 feet, straight down, to the ground, and maybe overhanging, all the way below you. That's super cool. For some people, it would freak them out, right?
For people,
it would.
yeah.
But
If you have vertigo, do not listen to this conversation.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so we're gonna do something terrible right now, and that is fast forward like 20 years from your Baffin Island expedition that you thankfully survived, to your decision to quit your job and become mobile and live the van life. Walk me through that decision-making process.
I feel like I have a little bit. I've described it as a, Peter Pan complex. I've had this great life, started climbing, in my teens, a lot of climbing when I was in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And I like that feeling, and I like doing it, and it's very satisfying to me. And I want to be able to do that until the day I die. And so, working a full-time job, and being a good, citizen of society, is something.
Overrated?
Yes, is something. Yeah, thank you. Put the words in my mouth. Yeah, so that's a good way to put it. It's overrated. I've always wanted to just continue that, and I don't know, I guess I've almost struggled with that a little bit, as feeling like there's this Peter Pan complex, which has this negative connotation to it. Like, why didn't you just grow up and have kids and have a 9-to-5 job and blah 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 blah. Well, and most of my friends, not all, but most of my friends, even ones that I climbed with a lot, when we were in our 20s, that is the path that they've gone down.
You have to be dangerous though, because it can be dangerous though, because if you do grow up, and growing up is terrible, but if you do have to grow up, you also have to make sure you're not switching off a part of your soul that makes you happy. Like you can't just, I don't know, like it must be just devastating to have to flip that switch and just be like, that part of my life is over. I mean, some people always say like, oh, you close one door, another opens for you. But I'm like, not when it's climbing, not when it's adventuring, not when it's doing expeditions. All that shit stays with you forever. You can't just turn that off.
But I think a lot of folks just think that that's how life works. That it's these different stages, and you like you said, one door closes and then the next stage opens. Whereas it's a good analogy. I prefer to keep the door open, So, when Sunny and I met, she's, well, first of all, she's much younger than me, number one. And number two is, she's a incredible adventurer, and that was something that her and I really, really connected on. And so, I was able to, save up enough money to be able to, to be able to quit my job. And that was, on one hand terrifying, but not really. It was really pretty liberating and exciting. I was like, holy cow, we're going to move into this rust bucket van and be able to, climb as much as we want and adventure as much as we want. And so, like I said, while on one hand it was a little terrifying, that was, 10%, and the other 90% was being super excited and stoked to be able to have this opportunity to do that. I guess the other part of that, though, was, also understanding that, money was going to run out, and, we could only do it for so long. And so we needed to, kind of maximize every day. So going back to one of your questions about international trips, again, when you have a job, and you get 2 weeks off a year, maybe 3 weeks off, yeah, you can do an Alaska trip in 2 weeks, I mean, whether you're successful or not will depend on the weather, and so, you're kind of rolling the dice on that. But in essence, having a regular job with a couple of weeks of vacation kind of limits your ability to do international trips. And so I was pretty excited at that point to be able to, not only, climb around in the Western U.S., but also do some international trips.
Yeah, I mean, it must be just incredible to finish a climb and then not have to think like, oh, I'm going to have to be back at work next week.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I'm headed up to Yosemite right now. And I've always said that as a big wall climber, one of the worst things for a big wall climber is to have a deadline on the back end, because things are always going to be slower. They're always going to take more time than you expect. And I've seen, and I've had it happen to me, but I see it happen all the time with other climbers where they'll get, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8 pitches up a route, and it's taking them longer, and they're looking and they're like, I have to be back at work, in 3 days, and they bail because of that. And so, that not having, a deadline on the back end is really liberating.
Yeah. No, I can see that. And what made you, what made you kind of settle in Utah? Like, here you are, you've quit your job, you've met Sonny, you guys are driving around, climbing at will, going off on these adventures. Sounds idyllic, in every way, shape, or form. But eventually, you kind of start this chapter of your life that you're in now, which is your Utah life, which I'd love to also get into a little bit.
Yeah. So, like I said, we knew that money wasn't going to last. Sonny and I talked a lot about it. Her background coming from, kind of corporate, kind of high power, world. For me, I'd been in the corporate world, for on and off for a number of years. And we both kind of, in talking about it, realized that we wanted to make our own path and not necessarily, go back to working for someone else.
Yeah,
Sonny, 2 weeks off a year.
Yeah, Sonny had a really tough run with the management consulting. Yeah,
she did. I mean, at the same time, she made bank, and that allowed her to maximize, what little time she had. And for me, I was just like, when I was a sales rep, I was my own boss. Kind of. I mean, you're still working for companies, but, back then, because it was more seasonal, I was my own boss. So we had, kind of made the path that, we didn't want to go back and work for somebody else. We wanted to do our own thing. And as a climber, one of the things that we talked about is we love the desert. We love the desert Southwest. I'd been climbing in Moab for, 30, 35 years or more. And it was obvious that there was a large climbing contingent in Moab. And so we came up with the idea of building a climbing gym in Moab. And so that was our way of, kind of doing something on our own. We, of course, didn't have the money for it. We did find an investor, a friend of mine that owned some gyms in Colorado, agreed to invest in that. But as we started looking at it, the real estate in Moab is super expensive. And Sonny, with her financial background, we did all the financials around it, and we're just like, if it was our money, we wouldn't invest in this project. So we didn't feel comfortable taking somebody else's money if we wouldn't have invested our own money in that project. Thank God we didn't try to go down that route because, of course, COVID hit, shortly thereafter. And, that was really hard on climbing gyms.
Yeah.
So when we had made the decision not to pursue the Moab climbing gym side of things, we're like, okay, let's just see what else is out there. So I started looking at some, business for sale sites. And one of the things that I found was, and for Moab, and most of the business for sale sites, they're broader than one town. It's all of Utah or all of the, the Western U.S. And one of the things that we did see is that most of the businesses for sale were restaurants. They were, lodging, stuff like that. I'm like, I don't know squat about those things, and I'm pretty sure I don't want to be in either of those businesses.
I need to be outside.
Yeah, exactly. And so I did find on this one business for sale site this guide business that was for sale down in Kanab, and I kind of sent it to Sonny as a joke because I didn't really take it seriously. Now, Sonny and I had done this big backpack trip, the 9-day backpack trip in the Grand Canyon earlier that year. And after that trip, and it was a really super rainy trip, we were wet a lot of the time, we came out of the Grand Canyon and up through Kanab. And this is the weird thing, is I remember sitting at a traffic light, and there's 2 lights in Kanab, and I'm like, Kanab, this is a pretty interesting town. I said, I could see living here. I don't recall ever saying that about any other place, So that was kind of a weird, kind of fortuitous thing. But this is, like 8 months earlier. So anyway, I sent this thing to Sonny as kind of a joke, I was like, we could do this. And I don't think she looked at it right away. I think it actually took her about 2 weeks to look at it. And she looked at it and she was like, I don't know, maybe we should take a look at this.
Yeah, there's a business there.
There's a business here. And that was right before her and I were leaving for Nepal. And we were guiding an Everest Base Camp trip. And then after that trip was over, we were staying. We wanted to try this new route on this peak called Kusum Kanguru. So I reached out to the buyer, said, hey, I'm going to be gone for the seller said, I'm going to be gone for a couple of months, but, could we meet, after we get back from Nepal? And so that was in November. So we drove over to Kanab after we got back from Nepal. And, we had this meeting with the buyer who is obviously burned out.
The seller.
Or excuse me.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. The seller. So he was obviously burned out. And, I told Sonny after we met with him the first time, I said, either he needs to sell this business quickly or it's going to go under. And so push comes to shove. We made an offer. It was a seller financed business. We were able to scrape together a down payment from family and friends. We put that together, and we ended up closing on the business on March 6, 2020, right when COVID was starting to take hold. Shut the business down 10 days after buying it because
that's got to be a great feeling.
It was it was an auspicious start. It wasn't the start that we had hoped for. But then, everything kind of started to take off, several months later. And, kind of the rest is history. And so that's how we ended up in Utah, and it's been a great base for us. I go back, my daughter lives in Boulder, and I go back to Boulder to see her. And I'm like, because I never thought I would leave Boulder, with the access and variety of climbing there. I was like, I'll probably die here, But I go back to Boulder now, and I'm like, holy cow, there's so many people and so many cars and so much traffic, and it's just crazy here. And I like my little 2-light 5,000 person town, and and that sort of lifestyle, and it does allow me to now do stuff like I'm doing right now, which is being gone for probably the next 3 weeks, during our busy season, but being able to kind of take a lot of time off to be able to go do what I want to do. And Sonny does the same thing.
Yeah. I can't imagine coming from a town in southern Utah with 2 streetlights to now being in Los Angeles and coming to see it.
Yeah. Actually, the traffic wasn't too bad driving into town yesterday until the last 5 miles.
Yeah, the last 5 miles would take it 3 hours.
Yeah. Forever. I was like, holy cow, I'm only like 11 miles away, but it's going to take me an hour and a half to get there.
It's so crazy. I lived in Switzerland off and on for the last few years, and because I thought I'd give that a try, but it didn't really stick. But like I never had a car, never had to take a taxi, never had to do anything. Just the train goes everywhere, and I'm just like, what? Where did the U.S. miss out on public transportation? It's just awful.
Yeah, I know that's very true. And Switzerland is one of my best friends lives in Andermatt, and it's an amazing spot. I love it over there.
Yeah. I've got a friend there, Danny. He's a really quite a well-known ice climber, and he's done some of the speed records and things like that on the Eiger North Face and this kind of stuff. So he's pretty hardcore, but he's it's a nice little pocket of the world to visit from time to time.
Yes, I love it over there. But yeah, it's very different here than it is in Kanab, but it's fine. I'm here for a couple of days and then I'll be back.
And so, what's the name of the company in Utah now that you're running?
Yeah, so it's called Dreamland Safari Tours, and business has been around for 23 years. We're the third owners of the business, and it's thriving. But like any business, it has its trials and tribulations, and I feel like for Sunny and I, we're a great match because of her kind of finance and marketing background, versus my sales and operations background. And so, we work really, really well together.
Plus you guys you guys own that lifestyle. I mean, no one can fuck with you. It's like, we've done everything and now we're going to take you out for a little adventure in Utah, right? But
but that's not totally true because, with the size of the business, I rarely guide at all. I mean, I'm behind the scenes, we've got about 20 employees. So, there's a lot that goes on, on the business side. So I'm not out, with guests, rarely out with guests. Sunny a little bit more than me, but yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, just even as being that business owner, right? Like you have the qualifications to help other people have good adventures, right? Facilitating it through your guiding. Like, it's not like you just bought an adventure business because you don't know anything about adventure.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we've expanded a lot and we've, the old business had a lot of guests that were, limited mobility and stuff like that, whereas we've expanded to much more adventurous, hikes and backpacks and stuff like that, kind of, to your point, kind of mirroring our personalities.
Yeah, which are extreme.
Well, we don't do anything super extreme, but we do some pretty cool kind of, things that are, very definitely off beaten path and a lot more adventurous than a lot of other companies do.
So if someone wanted to go to Southern Utah and connect with Dreamland, what would they be looking at? Like, what kind of stuff are you guys really specializing in for your part of the world?
Yeah, so we do mostly hiking, backpacking, sightseeing tours, and if we do stuff that's super easy to super hard. We also, we're in the business of helping folks have fantastic vacations and getting great memories and bringing back photos. And so we do a lot of work, with photographers and non-photographers to get great photos. And we also run photography workshops where we have professional photographers that we work with that, we'll run those for folks that want, to get into the fine details of, say, maybe something like, Milky Way photography or, other aspects of astrophotography. And so those are kind of the key areas that we operate in. We don't do any climbing. We don't do any canyoneering, at least right now. It's mostly kind of on foot adventures.
Okay, very nice. Well, Utah is such a beautiful part of the world, so it must be a joy to kind of help facilitate having your guests have great experiences there.
Yeah, and for us, we're 35 minutes from the east entrance to Zion. and Zion is, one of the busiest, most visited national parks. But, as a climber, there's a lot of climbing there as well, which is fantastic, and it's always dicey when folks ask me, because Bryce Canyon is also near us. They're like, well, what's your favorite park, Bryce or Zion? I'm like, well, I need to qualify this by saying I'm a climber, and there's no climbing in Bryce, so, Zion is definitely my favorite.
What's the mentality like, or what's the emotion like? So going back to your 30s, you're climbing all around the world, you're going on these adventures, you're climbing in the United States, but you're working for someone else. So you're kind of going off on these adventures, and then you have to come back to a corporate environment where you're not running the show. So, and now you're kind of going off and having these adventures, and holy shit, Sunny talked to me all about what happened in Alaska for 4 straight years in a row, and then how she just did her 1,000. But now you're kind of going, around the world, around the U.S., having these great adventures, and now you have to come back to your own business.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just kind of curious, like, was it easier going off and having epic adventures and not having to be the boss as well, or was it more stressful? Like, what's your feeling about that?
Yeah. So for me, I'm a business person, and I'm very invested in making whatever business I'm involved in successful. And so I would almost say that when I work for someone else, it was easier for me to disconnect. Okay. Working for myself now, it's really hard for me to disconnect. And, I kind of have to force myself, to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm going to be gone here for 3 weeks. I'll come back to, probably, 1,500, 2,000 emails. But I'm going to want to get back into that, really quickly. And I'm going to probably, until I go up on LCAP, I'll be checking my phone, looking at emails, and, answering emails and solving things. But, I do think that when you work for someone else, I mean, I was always in kind of a leadership role. And so it wasn't like I was just a worker bee. I was in a leadership role, so I did take pride and responsibility for the positions that I was in. But yeah, it was easier to when I was working for someone to just say, you know what, I'm turning the phone off, and I'm doing my thing. With that said, if you think about it, I mean, email, that really started to become a thing, late
90s?
Well, the web, the internet, yeah. But, email was, earlier than that. And so, I think back to how carefree it was. Like when I was first climbing in Yosemite in the late 70s, early 80s, one of the things that happened is, my mom would drive me from the Bay Area to Yosemite and drop me off and come pick me up 3 months later.
3 months?
Yeah. So I would go to Yosemite and I would climb for the summer, and then she would come pick me up. So the only way the pre-cell phones, right? So the only way I would, communicate is, go put the coin in or call collect. Is usually what you do with your parents. Right? I'd call my parents collect and be like, hey, can you come pick me up, on Saturday, type of thing. And so it's interesting to think back to those days when you didn't have 24/7 connectivity like you do now. When, I didn't have a cell phone, and so you were in the moment. You didn't have any sort of connectivity with the outside world, and then even, when the internet started coming about, we were talking a little bit earlier about, how did you get information, before, the internet was really a thing. And yeah, it was, paper, it was word of mouth, it was friends, and that was really cool, to go up on a climb with just some very basic knowledge about it,
mm-hmm.
versus today, where you can go up on a climb and you can watch people's videos about it. You can get just blow by blow beta on, the whole route and how much gear, what gear, where do you put your foot, whatever it is, for the climb. I mean, it was really, I think, I don't know what word I want to use, but liberating almost to be able to, kind of figure it out versus have everything kind of spoon-fed to you like it is today.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so different.
It's funny. I really did want to, because I really wanted to hear, how you used to do these expeditions before, because like for me, I plan between 8 and 10 expeditions a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of do one a month for the whole year when we're doing a proper season of television. And the way I did it, or the way I still do it, is I go onto YouTube. So first of all, I'm looking at maps and stuff like that, trying to find really remote parts of the world, right? And then I go onto YouTube and I find one crazy motherfucker who went out there with like a GoPro.
Right.
And then I'm like, okay, if this man or woman or whatever can get this with a GoPro,
right,
and then if I can bring my entire team in and we can like do it properly, then I'm like, now I got a TV show, right? And I was like, and that's how I did it. And I couldn't imagine having to go in there totally blind.
Yeah.
Not knowing, maybe having a guide, but not even really understanding the landscape or what we're getting into. But again, that's where the adventure is. That's where that moment of the unknown, taking that first step, that's the addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. In '87, one of my favorite climbs that I've done is Cerro Torre down in Patagonia. And in '87, I think there were 2 buildings in El Sultan. It's a full-on town, now. But, the thing that was different back then, and as Kelly Cordes in his book, The Tower, talks about is, there was old Patagonia and new Patagonia. And old Patagonia, the weather down there is notorious, right? And so how did you figure out what the weather was going to do? You used a barometer.
Mm-hmm.
If the barometer was changing positively, you'd start hiking.
Mm-hmm.
And if it wasn't, you wouldn't. And we made a lot of false starts where the barometer was going up and it was looking good, and then it went up for a little bit and then it came back down. And so just the adventure of it, was completely different from what it is today, where you have now in El Sultan, you have, internet cafes, and you have like these really, really detailed weather reports that you can see, and you can be like, in 5 days, there's a weather window that I'm going to go up in.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have anything like that, then.
Yeah.
And so, the technology these days and the visibility, like you said, into these areas, it kind of, there's still places you can go, right, that are blank spots on the map.
Just fewer and fewer
and fewer in between out there. Back in the 70s, 80s, 90s even, there were a lot more, and it was, it sounds egotistical to say, that there was more adventure to be had, because you can make stuff as adventurous or less as you want. But when you didn't have all that beta that you could get, when you didn't have all that visibility, when you didn't have, weather reports, like you do now, the unknown was much, much greater. And that's one of the cool things about climbing, and I think about adventure in general.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. Look, I really, this has been an amazing conversation. I promise you, I would love to have you come back at a later stage sometime, and we can talk about that 20-year gap between Banff and Island and Utah, because I'm sure you did some pretty amazing stuff in there as well. But no, I can't thank you enough for swinging by and sharing, a little bit of your life and some of these incredible stories that you've collected along the way. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate it. And you've had a lot of experiences as well. So it's great to talk to someone who gets it.
We travel so heavy though; it's so bad. Like we have so much gear, but it's nice to I guess my technical climbing is probably the weakest part of my adventuring. So like getting to sit here and pick your brain about some of the stuff you've done has been incredible.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think, I didn't mention is, on the Baffin Island trip, like we had been in contact with National Geographic, and, they had talked to me about sending a writer and sending John Krakauer with us on that trip. And, we decided, that was going to take away from the, our vision for the trip and the adventure of the trip and having a second or third person and all that aspect, and so it just didn't seem as authentic to us, and so that I've always liked that kind of authentic 2-person trip where you just have to figure it out on your own.
Yeah,
doing trips with larger groups just hasn't been kind of my thing.
Well, going with John Krakauer would have been wonderful because your story would have probably ended up being a best-selling book and then a movie. But at the same stages too, it's like you can't fucking bring someone out there who can't climb.
Yeah.
Like if someone can climb at your level, then they're an anchor, in your forward movement. Like it's just not possible.
Yeah. No, and that's that we said no. So. Though, and again, Sunny and I have talked about it, and she's like, again, it's one of those, kind of Y intersections where if we had gone that route, like you said, things would have been quite different.
Yeah.
So,
well, John probably would have had a sat phone.
Probably. Good point. Yeah, I think National Geographic, would have been open to paying for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much for swinging by today, and I really appreciate it. Now we can go to this wide one just to show everyone we're in the same room.
Perfect.
No Zoom calls here.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks you so much for swinging by.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for the time.